Hello, I would like to welcome everyone to the second day of the Bandung Spirits Conference. Before we begin, I just want to note today, like yesterday, all the talks will be broadcast live via Zoom, and anyone watching online is invited to ask questions after each of the talks by using the Q&A or F&A function in German, and we'll be happy to pose your questions for you during the Q&A sessions. So first up today is Andrea Benvenuti. He is a professor of international relations at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Actually, I haven't made it to the last step yet, associate professor. Academic can be so pedantic, but I haven't been promoted to the level as yet. But thanks, Dominic. I really enjoy your endorsement. I wish it was true. Okay, let me first focus on Nehru and his arrival in Bandung. My task is made easier by Professor Philip Pirot and Vera May yesterday, Dr. Vera May, when they just presented us with a number of very interesting photos and cartoons on the conference. And really, they brought the conference alive. So thank you, because I was also spared the task of producing photos. But as I'm speaking on Nehru's arrival in Bandung, I think all of you will have in mind the photos and cartoons that yesterday Philippe and Vera presented to us. So I would start by saying that Nehru arrived in Bandung on the 16th of April, 1955, was a leader who stood at the peak of his influence in international affairs and also bestrode Indian politics like a colossus. Since 1947, he had been the Prime Minister of India, as well as the Foreign Minister. Since then, he had earned the reputation of a symbol of anti-colonial struggle, the voice of a resurgent Asia, and also the champion of non-alignment. By the time he arrived in Indonesia, Nehru was really an international celebrity, and perhaps I wouldn't stretch it too far if I said that it was also a household name. After all, my late mom, who had no training in international relations, who grew up in the countryside, rural Italy, middle nowhere, I remember her speaking very vividly of the Pandit Nehru, and using the word Pandit, to which Nehru was often referred in the 50s. So I just, Pandit Nehru, Pandit Nehru. I think she had few leaders in mind, some more notable than others, Khrushchev, Eisenhower, but certainly one was Jawaharlal Nehru. So I think if Jawaharlal Nehru was remembered by my mom, almost by definition, although I can't be sure 100%, he would have been a household name. So it's no surprise that when Nehru arrived in Bandung, he was treated as a star. He received the star treatment. As soon as the plane landed on the Bandung airfield, he attracted significant press attention from the international press as well as the Indonesian press, and also from the Bandung residents. As he was walking with other leaders along a Bandung main drag to the main conference, he was cheered by the residents of Bandung, and he was one that was cheered the most, together with Nasser, who was very popular, and the Chinese premier, as well as Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai. But even though Nehru was one of the biggest names in Bandung, alongside President Nasser of Egypt and Zhou Enlai, he was not the prime mover, if I could use these words, or the mastermind behind the first Asian-African conference. Someone else was the mastermind and the prime mover, perhaps a figure, and nowadays is probably forgotten, whose name sometimes when I mention his name to my Australian colleagues, so-and-so who? The name is Dr. Ali Sastro-Midjojo, who was the Prime Minister of Indonesia. He had become Prime Minister in 1953. For the previous 3 years, he had been ambassador in Washington. He had been brought back to Jakarta to form a new government after the fall of the Wilopo government. And he was a kind of minute man, sporting a Van Dyke goatee beard. He had been one of the most important figure of the nationalist movement in Indonesia during the Republic times, from 1945 to 49. He had held various ministerial positions, like Nehru. He had the privilege of having visited not British prisons, but Dutch prisons in Indonesia. And so he was perhaps, certainly was not as charismatic as Sukarno. He didn't have the penchant for the theatrics as Sukarno had. He was not as theatrical as his president. But nonetheless, he was a steady operator, someone that was actually quite well equipped, as the Indians themselves recognized, to deal with Indonesian politics at a crucial stage of the political life of that early independent nation. The reason why I spent few words on Ali Sastro-Midjojo is because, again, he was, or at least the documents that I've read, pointed me in his direction. He was the prime mover of Bandung, as Krishna Menon, Nehru's close advisor and close associate. He said, well, the conference is not India's baby, it's actually Indonesia's. And so I think it's important to spend a few words on Ali Sastro-Midjojo. But I'm coming back to Nehru because Bandung was indeed not India's baby. Of course, Sastro-Midjojo, he had the imprimatur of Sukarno, but nonetheless, he was the one that carried Indonesian diplomacy forward in those crucial months. Initially, the Indian reaction to a proposal made by Ali Sastro-Midjojo at the Colombo Conference in April 1954, the so-called Colombo group that Professor Chatterjee also mentioned yesterday, that's where Sastro-Midjojo put this proposal in front of the other prime minister. Kotelawala, the prime minister of Ceylon, UNU, the prime minister of Burma, Sastro-Midjojo as well, and then, of course, the prime minister of Pakistan, Mohammed Ali Bogra. Nehru's reaction was not very positive, and for that matter, all the others were not really keen on the Indonesian idea. They tried to stall it by saying to Sastro-Midjojo, well, this requires a little bit more study. Ooh, not so quick. Just you start sounding out different countries, and then we'll see what happens. However, Nehru had already given the Indonesian an inkling of his reluctance to consider an Asian-African conference. In 1953, October 1953, he told the visiting Indonesian foreign minister, Sunario, that cooperation among Asian-African states was not encouraging. Of course, Sunario was suggesting, without commitment, that Indonesia was looking forward a new Asian-African conference. And Nehru told him, cooperation among Asian-African states is not encouraging. The group, Nehru said, was much too amorphous and vague. These countries are pulling in different directions, hardly an endorsement for the emerging Indonesian position. And so that's to tell you that Nehru was not particularly keen. It's true that Nehru's trajectory in relation to Afro-Asianism underwent a change from 1947, as again Professor Chatterjee reminded us yesterday of. He played an important role in organizing the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi. Then in 1949, again another Asian conference in Delhi, over the future of Indonesia. Nehru tried to put forward the idea of a mechanism that would allow Asian African countries to stay in contact and to strengthen collaboration among them. But that proposal, informal as it was, didn't quite fly. And then between 1949 and really 1953-54, Nehru became more skeptical of an African-Asian or Asian-African caucus. Under the impulse of Indonesia again, an Asian-African or Asian-Arab group was established at the United Nations, but Nehru and Krishna Menon as well came to the conclusion that yes, despite some successes in championing anti-colonial causes, that group had not been quite effective on reaching a common ground on a number of other issues. And so it's interesting that it's not until late 1954 that actually Nehru decides and agrees to give the green light to Sastromi Jojo that is willing to support an Asian-African conference. Sastromi Jojo travels to Delhi in September, late September 1954, still not sure that Nehru would say yes. Imagine you carrying a ring to your bell and hoping that she would say, yes, I'll marry you. Well, Sastromi Jojo carried the ring, but he wasn't sure whether Nehru was willing to agree to the matchmaking. He gave actually a speech to the Lok Sabha, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, and even until then, he wasn't sure whether Nehru would embrace him or reject him. I apologize for the slightly amorous metaphor, but I think it's just to lighten up what otherwise would be perhaps a dry diplomatic topic.
Could you please tell us about the ring?
And so the reason I'm saying this is because as a result of their talks, eventually Nehru agrees to actually give the go-ahead. And so the question for me was why actually someone that was so closely associated with Afro-Asianism, who's seen as one of the leading figure, the towering figures, was so reluctant. and what actually made him change his mind. Why did he decide at the very end to accept Sastromi Giorgio's proposal? So in my research, I came up with, in my book, I came up with 4 reasons, one quite contingent, and the other 3 more fundamental and more substantial. Let me start with the easiest one and perhaps the most contingent one. In mid-late 1954, Nehru realizes that actually the political position of the Sastromi Giorgio government in Jakarta hangs in a balance. He relies on the support of the PKI, the Partai Komunis Indonesia, for survival, and is going through a pretty difficult economic situation, inflation, deficit in the balance of payments, the low prices for commodities. So Indonesia, economically speaking, is in a rather parlous state. And plus, in September 1954, there's a scandal that strikes President Sukarno. The reason is one of the main is several amorous dalliances. The news of an affair with a married woman, Artini, the wife of a oil, someone that was working on an oil, government official, but working on an oil producing platform, if I could put it that way, as he was married to his 3rd wife, Fatmawati. So that was really bad look, because although Sukarno was supposed to be an impartial figure, he was closely associated with the party that Sastromi Giorgio was leading, the Partai Nasional Indonesia. And since the general elections were scheduled for 55, well, there was a fair chance that actually Sastromi Giorgio could possibly fall. Indonesia would undergo political crisis. And so the conference was a way to also help a potential ally in need. So that was the contingent reason. But there were now 3 more important and fundamental reasons that were linked to key and overriding objectives in Indian foreign policy, as well as really points or aspects that were very close to Nehru's visions of regional and more broadly international relations. These were the 3 reasons. The first one was his determination to oppose what he viewed as an aggressive American containment of communism in Asia. 2 aspects of the Eisenhower administration containment policy troubled him. The first one was the decision made by Eisenhower and Foster Dulles between the end of 53, early 54, to sign a defense agreement with, guess who? India's arch enemy. So imagine the disappointment, and that's an understatement, that the disappointment felt by the Indians. The other issue was the American desire to establish an American-led regional alliance in the second half of 1954 to stop further communist or presumed communist advances in Southeast Asia following the fall of Dien Bien Phu in North Tonkin in Indochina in 1954, in May 1954. Basically the creation of what then became known as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, that was supposed to be the Asian NATO. didn't last that long, wasn't particularly successful. The treaty wasn't really providing the same guarantees that NATO would provide to its European allies, although yesterday, over a conversation with Bern over lunch, we discussed actually how strong was the American guarantee to its European allies. And of course, there's a question mark there as well. But in Indian eyes, the American agreement with Pakistan, of course, posed serious threat. Not only brought the Cold War closer to India, but more to the point, it eroded Indian military advantage over Pakistan, and also more problematically, the Indian argued that Western military kit and weapons could actually encourage Pakistan to take India on. With regard to SEATO, the problem was the SEATO Nehru regarded as a deeply destabilizing organization. It was likely to undermine the Geneva Accords, which sanctioned the temporary division of Indochina along the 17th parallel between the north, controlled by the Viet Minh, and the south, which would remain within the Western orbit unless supposedly election would be taken in 1956, but the Americans made sure that those elections never took place. And so it was fearful that SEATO would undermine these accords that were reached with significant difficulty. Also, he felt the SEATO was actually risking of undermining Sino-Soviet support for peaceful coexistence. With the death of Stalin in March 1953, the collective leadership in Moscow slowly but surely moves towards peaceful coexistence. And so do the Chinese for similar ideological reasons, but also for important Chinese national interests. So Nehru saw that this was a welcome development in Soviet and Chinese foreign policy. And if the Americans came up with this half-baked, as he would put it, although not exactly in those words, SEATO, well, the Americans were risking actually to undermining this positive, this hope of a better understanding between the great powers. And also, more problematically, SEATO could actually cause a serious clash between the United States and China, and plunging Southeast Asia in possible new war. The second reason for Nehru supporting the conference, the Bandung Conference, or the Indonesian initiative rather, was that China, as of 1953, was embracing peaceful coexistence. China was moving away from revolutionary radicalism towards peaceful coexistence. And he felt that this shift in Chinese policy was an opportunity that Nehru could not possibly turn down. He wanted to take advantage of this shift in Chinese policy to secure Chinese long-term commitment to regional peace and stability in Asia, and to reduce the risk of a potentially hostile power on India's doorstep. Out of my diplomatic jargon, just let me paint you the picture of what Nehru had in mind in terms of his grand design. If we manage, and if we, I mean the Indian government, if India manages to bring China out of the cold, to bring China out of isolation, partly self-imposed, but partly driven by the American policy of commitment, if we manage to buttress this shift in policy, if we manage to engage China with the rest of the region, well, if we do that, that's the best way of stemming American containment policy. And that's where the third fundamental reason comes into play. He saw Sastromi Giorgio's plans for a conference as a chance to use what then became the Asian-African Conference in Bandung as a platform to promote his vision of grand design of areas of peace, as Nehru called them, and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. In Nehru visions, an area of peace was a neutralized area, neutralized zone, where states, nations rejected Cold War alignments and pursued non-alignment as the guiding principles or the ordering principle of their foreign policies. Areas of peace in Nehru visions was to be underpinned by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the Panchshila, which actually were Chinese idea with which Nehru made Nehru run with and supported. These 5 principles, there was nothing particularly mind-blowing about this principle. They're all contained in the Charter of the United Nations, but let me briefly mention them to you. The first one was the respect of territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference, equality and cooperation for mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Nehru argued that these were to be the new code of conduct to carry out and pursue foreign policy and foreign relations in Asia and elsewhere. And unless countries conform to this principle, they wouldn't be able to create those called areas of peace. So to wrap it up, just in case you don't miss anything in Nehru's vision, and I told Francisca to please raise her hand, 5 minutes to closing time, so I promised that I would be ruthlessly on time. So I'm planning to deliver. Read my lips, no more taxes, George Bush, 1991. Essentially, Nehru believed that the Bandung Conference could serve, or the Indonesian initiative leading to what then became the Bandung Conference, could serve as a means to commit China to its concept of areas of peace, to reassure Asian nations of China's peaceful intention, and win them over to the Indian idea of areas of peace, of a neutralized region, underpinned by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. He also hoped that Bandung would help take the wind out of the sails of American containment, and what he regarded, he didn't use this word, but others used it for him, but that's certainly what he had in mind. John Foster Dulles' pactomania, to use a word of the time. The American desire to establish alliances on the Chinese periphery to contain the People's Republic of China. And fourth, to reduce the risk posed by an hostile power, potentially China, next to the Indian border. In April 1954, India and China, after quite a few months of negotiations, agreed to an agreement on Tibet, where the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence were enshrined in the preamble to the agreement. So Nehru thought that this model could be transposed to a wider forum, presented to to a larger forum, and he basically tried to involve as many regional nations as possible and get them to subscribe to the idea of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. That was his main idea behind Bandung. But of course, there was also the idea of befriending China to also, if you like, reduce the risk of a potentially hostile power on India's border, hence not having to spend significant amount of money on defense and redirect these funds towards India's economic development. And maybe this is lost on you, but before Kissinger flew from Islamabad to Beijing in mid-1971, and then Nixon flew to Beijing in February 1972, the so-called opening to China, or Nixon goes to China, metaphorically, Nehru was going to China as well. He was doing a Nixon job before Nixon. I know it's difficult to compare Nixon to Nehru, it's almost comparing chalk and cheese, but there you go. I said it, so I can't withdraw it. So do what you may with this sort of implausible comparison. But you can see where he was trying to go. And so here I'm coming to the crux of my, the most important point I'm making in the book, that Nehru signed up for an Asian-African conference not because of deep emotional attachment to Afro-Asian internationalism. Rather, was driven by a desire to promote a third way in an increasingly polarized world and to forge a more stable regional order to bolster India's external security and domestic prosperity. In other words, Bandung was seen not exclusively, I would argue, but primarily as an exercise in Cold War diplomacy, not in Afro-Asian solidarity. And that's the main point of my research, and it's a point that, to some extent, challenged what yesterday Professor Robert Vitali referred to as myth-making in the broad Afro-Asian scholarship. And in the way he so effectively and vividly put it in the speech yesterday, and also in his article, The Midnight Ride of Kwame Nkrumah. And so, when I made this, reading the documents, I realized that that's the story that they were telling me. It's not that the archives are an oracle, and so I'm just their muse that just reveals what I find out, but nonetheless, just confronted with the archival evidence, I realized that I was going down a path that probably some wouldn't necessarily like in the broader field of Afro-Asian studies, but nonetheless, I felt compelled to make it. I can't, if I'm cooking an egg, I can't pretend I'm cooking a steak, so just I have to describe it as such. And also thank Robert Vitalis for his kind words on my work. So that's the main reason why Nehru, if I could put it that way, went to town, went to Bandung. Bandung was a crucial component of an ambitious and complex Cold War strategy before anything else. Let me now focus on, not so much on Nehru and Bandung, but on Nehru's trajectory post-Bandung as it relates to Afro-Asianism. The Bandung Conference produced mixed results for Nehru. After the conference ended, he called it an outstanding success. The conference, he said, marked a new chapter in the histories of Asia, Africa, and the world. It fostered a sense of solidarity among Afro-Asian nations and instilled the belief that Asia could stand on its own feet without being pushed around by Europe and the United States. He also wrote to the wife of the last Viceroy of India. The wife is Edwina Mountbatten. The other character, as you know, is Louis Mountbatten. He also waxed lyrical on the experience of actually meeting a number of Afro-Asian leaders in Bandung, an experience he described as being instructive and mesmerizing, although that's not the word they exactly used, but nonetheless, I think I'm quite faithful to what he said. I don't recall the exact word. More importantly, it looked as if his efforts to get China to commit to peaceful coexistence paid off. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai went a long way to reassure Afro-Asian leaders that China did not seek expansion, had no plans to subvert its neighbors, and was genuinely committed to regional stability. As Professor Chatterjee reminded us yesterday, and he put it quite vividly, Zhou Enlai played a virtuoso role in Bandung. I would call it, he was the snake charmer to everyone. Even countries that fear China were surprised how well behaved the Chinese premier and foreign minister was. Perhaps they thought he was a communist ogre. But in reality, certainly Zhou Enlai presented the presentable face of Chinese communists to the world, and he did actually quite impressively. The other story, of course, is that he was hard-nosed and hard-battled communist, so he was not a cuddly bear or a cuddly panda, if I were to use this stupid cultural metaphor, but again, make what you want of them. On the flip side, however, Nehru struggled to get his vision of a neutralized Asia accepted. Non-communist and pro-Western delegation questioned Nehru neutralism and strongly supportive defensive alliances. Actually, the discussion on the nature of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the validity and the acceptability for countries to engage in collective defense were quite lively. The Prime Minister of Ceylon, John Kotelawala, was the one that threw, what's the metaphor? Throwing the cats into the pigeon. Forgot the metaphor. Just yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Ben. Just my dodgy English, but that's exactly what I wanted to say. And then he was supported by Mohammed Ali Bogra. And then there was the leaders of Lebanon and Turkey. How do you dare, Mr. Nehru? You run a big country. Turkey is not too far from the Soviet Union, and we have, we just need to defend ourselves. Not everyone is able to survive without allies. Out of those discussions, the 5 principles, only 4 of these 5 principles were included in the 10 principles that came out of Bandung. There was, however, one of the 10 principles was that the principle of collective and individual defense was accepted. Although Nehru managed to have included another principle where it said more or less, yes, provided that actually the big powers don't take advantage of these alliances. But nonetheless, the story of Bandung is also, from a Nehru point of view, it's also how difficult it was for him to get actually, to put flesh to the idea of areas of peace, and to convince other nations that actually neutralism was the new game in town. Let me fast forward very quickly to the long-term impacts of Bandung for Nehru. Unfortunately for Nehru, the years following the Bandung Conference produced no less ambivalent results. On the bright side of things, on the positive ledger, Sito didn't turn out to be an aggressive tool of American containment that Nehru feared. It did not promote military intervention across Asia. After all, if you think about it, the American commitment to Vietnam was done outside the remit of Sito. Regional support for neutralism was on the rise, at least in the, how to put it, in the public diplomacy sphere. The idea of peaceful coexistence became a buzzword in all diplomatic exchanges, and that seemed to validate Nehru's vision of a non-aligned Asia. However, on the downside, it was pretty clear that all this talk about non-alignment, sticking to the 5 principles, all of this did not mean that Asia was turning into an area of peace, free of Cold War tensions, as Nehru wished. Far from it. All this talk did not offer and provide India with a kind of defense guarantee against regional threats. And in fact, when the going got tough, Nehru realized that actually his vision for how well constructed it was, for how to put it, let me find the exact word, alluring it was, because after all, I can't criticize him for trying to engage China, to get China to commit to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and to the areas of peace concept in front of everyone in Bandung. Nehru thought that that would be, if the Chinese could make that commitment, they would demonstrate that they were serious about peaceful coexistence. And if they weren't serious, well, all the other Asian countries would draw their conclusion and would say, well, we tried, but China doesn't play ball, and therefore, from now on, we won't trust her. But at least Nehru argued that we must try. We must try engagement. And Bandung was very much part of the engagement strategy that he tried to pull off. But the problem was, and again, I'm going back to the risque comparison between Nixon and Nehru. Nixon found himself with a China that was willing to play ball because they were scared of the Soviet Union, or extremely worried about the Soviet Union, and they, the Chinese, while in the late 50s, the Chinese were not really ready to play ball, according to, of course, Nehru's plan. And so, in the late 50s and early 60s, it's really when this main plank, this crucial component of Nehru neutralist Asian vision and all his conception of what Bandung meant in Indian foreign policy, when all of these fall apart, he realized that actually his gamble backfired. For his vision, of course, he had to rely heavily on China's support to peaceful coexistence, but when China launched an attack on India in October 1962, Nehru's grand design evaporated. In the crucible of war, Nehru tragically realized how shaky the foundation of visions really were. He really learned the hard way that all the talk about areas of peace and principle of peaceful coexistence provided no real insurance against Chinese aggression. He also realized how much he had misunderstood the nature of Mao Zedong's regime and its intention. For the Chinese, after all, peaceful coexistence was no more, I would argue, than an opportunistic response to the domestic and international circumstances in which China found itself in the 50s. It was, to use communist lingo, if I could put it that way, when the balance of forces the correlation of forces, tilts against the communist bloc, then it's the time to pursue peaceful coexistence with the nasty Western capitalism. It's Lenin. And in a sense, he didn't realize actually the peaceful coexistence was an instrumental policy that China ran with it as long as it suited Chinese national interests and international interests. However, when in the late 50s, China moved back to a more militant and radical foreign policy with the launch of the Great Leap Forward, and then after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, what we could call the Great then Leap Backwards, given the results, well, Nehru's strategy was found wanting. But you know, I don't know how it feels for you, but in life, when you're presented with a problem, sometimes problems don't come. They come in more than one. So if things couldn't get any worse, the breakdown in Sino-Indian relationship created another major problem for Nehru. How do you say in English? Problems always come in pair?
It never rains, but it pours.
Thank you. I'm also exercising my English with you. I'm trying metaphors, dodgy metaphor on you, hoping that just you provide me with. Thank you, Susan. And as I was saying, the breakdown in Sino-Indian relationship created another major problem for India. By supporting China's participation in the Bandung Conference, Nehru paved the way for Beijing's growing engagement with the Afro-Asian world. Although Beijing participation was a calculated move on Nehru's part to turn China into a responsible regional stakeholder, his plan backfired. China exploited the Afro-Asian movement to promote first its revolutionary anti-imperialism and weaken India's influence in the developing world. In the early 60s, China redoubled its efforts to promote revolutionary change in the Third World and stepped up its crusade against the evils of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism. What President Sukarno, with his unlimited ability to create new and interesting acronyms, called NECOLIM. In fact, supported by the likes of Indonesia, Ghana, Pakistan, and Algeria, China also advocated for an anti-imperialist second Bandung and favored a more revolutionary definition of Afro-Asianism. And so, to be sure, in the years following, I nearly finished, following the Bandung Conference, no longer Nehru placed a high value on African-Asian solidarity to advance India's national interests, given the Afro-Asian nations had diverse agendas and persistent disagreements. If I could rely on two metaphors, one by Professor Ben Zakaria yesterday, and the other one, again, Professor Chatterjee. Yesterday, Ben referred to the intoxication induced by the Bandung spirit. He used, of course, a double sens, so what in English you call a double entendre. But in a sense, if Nehru, I would argue that Nehru was never intoxicated by Bandung, but if he was intoxicated only for a few months. In fact, even as the conference was about to close, certain countries like Egypt, like China, wanted to establish a permanent secretariat to, if you like, ensure that the Bandung process would play out and continue in following years. Nehru and the Burmese Prime Minister Nu didn't want to go down that way. Professor Chatterjee used, again, an expression that I like very much, where the spirit was willing, but the flesh was not so weak.
The flesh was weak.
For Nehru, the flesh was certainly weak, but also the willingness, again, if he was willing, it was only for a limited period of time. In 1959, he told one of his closer advisors that most Afro-Asian countries, and I quote him, are at 6s and 7s, and I'm not clear in my mind as to what we should achieve by such a conference at this stage. He was referring to a second Afro-Asian conference, a second Bandung, that countries like China and Indonesia were eager to organize. Hence, for instance, Nehru Private Secretary C.R. Srinivasan in 1957, he told an high-ranking Australian diplomat in Delhi that there would be no second Bandung anytime soon if India can help it. In his memoirs, Nehru Chief of Security K.F. Rastamji wrote that Nehru never liked talking about the conference after he returned to India from Indonesia. I quote, whenever he spoke about Bandung, a cloud gathered over his face. And indeed, until he died in 1964, Nehru resisted calls for a second Bandung conference. And he was not even particularly keen on the 1961 Belgrade non-aligned conference, which was something different. Still, despite this growing...
You're at 55 minutes now.
Did I go well? Oh. What can I say? Never trust an Italian. I promise you mountains, and I deliver just nothing. So just I apologize. If you just one minute. So it's quite in January I spent 3 weeks in Delhi working again in the archives, and I stumbled on a piece of information that I would have liked to have stumbled on earlier on, but nonetheless was a comment made by the Indian ambassador to Jakarta between 1954 to 56, Badruddin Tayyabji, a very just engaging and interesting character. He argued that he actually described the first Afro-Asian conference as an important milestone in the history of Indian diplomacy during the Cold War. He also called it a major diplomatic investment on the part of India. However, at the same time, he was quick to point out that Bandung also turned out to be a landmark of missed opportunities, and I was quoting him. For the amount we put into it, Tayyabji said, we got precious little out of it. So I guess the gist of my presentation was to really give you the idea of how much Nehru invested on Bandung, what Bandung meant to him, and what important part he played in his Cold War strategy. From his point of view, it had little to do with Afro-Asian solidarity, but the point was that when Chinese forces invaded Ladakh and what is nowadays Arunachal Pradesh, the northeastern frontier agency, in 1962, it became increasingly obvious to everyone, and to me as well, how precious little, if I were to paraphrase Tayyabji again, how precious little Nehru had gained from his Bandung investment. And again, maybe I was carried away. I didn't see your hand, Francisca. I apologize. You tried. You're so very polite here, and just unwillingly I took advantage of your politeness, and I didn't really see it. But thank you for listening to my talk.
Italians may or may not be trustworthy, but the overrun was already anticipated when you were quoting George H.W. Bush, because he famously failed to win a second term because he made the promise of no new taxes and then he raised taxes.
Exactly.
So yes, questions from the audience. Ben, I saw your hand first.
It's done? Yeah. I shall resist the temptation of trying to reframe the story because I've done it already once, but I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of things. One is in 1948 in New York, Nehru actually asked the Americans to recognize Communist China even before the People's Republic was declared, because he said this is not a communist movement, this is an Asian nationalism, and by not recognizing it, you will push it towards the Soviet Union. And he also makes the point that he doesn't like strong ties. He says somewhat mystically, the strongest ties are those ties that are not ties. But what I'm trying to get at is the skepticism about Bandung is present from the start, that he's not anticipating that a great deal will happen there. And so also in terms of the importance of bringing China into diplomatic circles is something that he has as a plank long before anything else happens. Now, I would tell the story of the breakdown of Sino-Indian relations differently from the point of view of not observing a border, but you know that's already been laid out by Neville Maxwell, so I won't have to do it. One last point, there's a Blackett report on Indian military capability from, I think, the late 1940s, and it says quite clearly that India can do nothing more than win a defensive war against a particular neighbor, and they mean Pakistan. So the reports have already made it clear that a military confrontation with China would not work. But the intermediary role of India in the Korean War and then in the Indo-Chinese conflict then also gives India a very strong position, which means I don't think it's such a far-fetched thing to suggest that Nehru has a role which is very important at the time.
Thank you, Ben.
If you want to respond, otherwise it's just...
Very quickly, on the last point, it's just, to me, looking at the diplomatic aspects of Nehru's diplomacy was a little bit of struggle, because in a sense, I saw clearly the rationale why he was doing that. And I cannot criticize him for trying the engagement path, to try to engage China and to see out of that engagement what would come out, precisely also for the reasons that you mentioned, because he was, of course, acutely aware of India's military position, and also perhaps he thought that in the early 50s China would not be, and maybe for 10 or 20 years he argued China would not present a threat to India for a number of reasons. And so it was only, I would say, logical to try to play that card, which was engagement. But perhaps he was a little bit too naive, or perhaps, as events turned out to be, China was not ready actually to play that game. So in diplomacy, it always takes two to tango. That's another trite metaphor, but in a sense, to what extent was really Nehru's fault rather than China's fault? So Nehru, in a sense, metaphorically extended the olive branch. Let's try engagement. But in reality, after a while, he just, he came to the conclusion that actually that had been perhaps the wrong policy to pursue. And it was not entirely beyond criticism for a number of other reasons, but I'll leave it at that.
Inda Utami. Here.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your very engaging and interesting presentation. First of all, I don't want to be rude, but perhaps I need to correct your pronunciation of Ali's name.
You're not rude.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's a must.
But his name was spelled in the old Indonesian spelling, but it should be pronounced as Ali Sastro Amijoyo, not Amijojo. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I'm here to learn as well, so thank you.
Yes, and the second one, your presentation is kind of destroying the myth in Indonesian history textbooks about that India and especially Nehru was Indonesia's closest allies in all these endeavors of anti-colonialism, Asian-African Conference, non-alignment movements. I mean, referring to his reluctance and how Ali Sastramijo was actually the one who tried to bring the ring to him, which is like, oh no, we didn't really learn that from Indonesian history textbooks, of course. And then now the question, because you left it hanging there when you mentioned that Nehru didn't really like it to talk about Bandung. So yeah, can you elaborate more in that point when when Francisca said that you ran out of time? Thank you.
Thank you, Inda. And thank you for correcting my pronunciation. Just I really appreciate that. Just otherwise I would keep making the mistake over and over. So thank you. It's interesting because again, as I was reading the declassified document, and you read his report to the Minister of External Affairs soon after the conference, as you read his letter to the chief ministers, as you read his letter to Edwina Mountbatten, he gives the impression that actually he had jolly good time in Bandung, that actually Bandung was successful. But then how do you explain the fact, for instance, that he didn't want to establish a permanent secretariat, that the Indonesians were very keen on establishing, that the Chinese were very keen on establishing, that the Egyptians were very keen on establishing, and other countries would have established it as well. And instead, he decided not to do that. And then, in the following years, when the Indonesians again pressed the Indians for at least a meeting of the Colombo powers, the powers that organized Bandung, that these 5 powers would meet to discuss the possibility of organizing a second Bandung, the Indonesians knocked their heads against the wall. Nehru said to them, no, actually, there's too much disagreement around what would an Afro-Asian conference and in reality, it is very, in the documents I found, it always comes back to the fact that there are too many disagreements between these countries. In order for these countries to reach a meaningful agreement on important international issues. Then in the early 60s, when actually Sukarno, but also China, pushed for a more radical interpretation of Afro-Asianism, Sukarno would say, no, it's not the Cold War, it's not the confrontation, the risk of nuclear war between the superpowers, that it's the issue of the day. And that's what Nehru actually started arguing in the early 60s. It's the fact that we have to fight the Nekolim powers. And Nehru actually argued, well, colonialism is on the wane. Nuclear Armageddon is a much more problematic issue. And that's when actually becomes even less in favor of a second Bandung. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Kingsho Chatterjee.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking of asking this as a question, but it partly goes to feed into what the last exchange was. So let me just rework this. You see, the problem of I have done very little work on the early years of Indian foreign policy, and one of the first things I see the difference between a colonial and the post-colonial archives, that in the post-colonial archives, not everything seems to be declassified. So you hear what Nehru is saying to his chief ministers, what Nehru is instructing his ambassadors to take the position, but the policy inputs that help Nehru decide, those documents are seldom declassified. But I'm very happy if you could correct me on this one if these have been declassified and somehow I have not seen it. So the point I'm trying to make is, in 1948, when Nehru took the Pakistani incursion on Kashmir to the United Nations, and it did not result in the desired objective, it would seem that from that point, there has been an instinctive suspicion in the Indian establishment towards multilateralism because Indians were not able to play it right. Okay, and that continued for several decades. If that is a valid proposition, then it would explain the resistance of the Indian establishment to institutionalizing a structure in Bandung or in any other place. India has always favored bilateralism, but from a position of strength. And it has gone with multilateralism when it has been left with no other alternative. Would you say that is a reasonable kind of proposition to make, given the nature of the declassification of the archive?
It's very reasonable. In fact, I think you hit on the nail. Just you could argue that Bandung, the way I sort of described it, was a specific moment in Indian foreign policy, the attempt for various reasons to multilateralize the issue of China. But then the reason why Nehru was actually, and coming back to India as well, was skeptical of the second Bandung route was precisely for the reason that you mentioned.
Because he saw that he couldn't play it the way he meant to.
Exactly.
Right.
Coming quickly to the issue of the Indian archives, yes, it's true. And of course we write history based on what is available. So it could be that in 10 years' time, I wish there'd be someone else, more archival material is released, and someone else, if he proves me wrong, I'll be all the happier for it, because that's the nature of academic research. But I think on Bandung itself, there's enough, the critical files have been declassified, and actually a good number of them can be downloaded from the exactly, from the National Archives of India online. I also relied on a number of Western declassified sources and the way in which, for instance, Indian diplomats were talking to the British or to the Australians or to the Americans. Of course, you always have to be aware of the fact that they were not necessarily 100% honest or revealing. But nonetheless, if you sort of put together the pieces of a puzzle, you get, I think, a fairly, but again, if someone in 10 years' time or 20 years' time with more documents proves me wrong, I'll buy him a beer, just because that's the nature of academic research.
So then we will buy you one.
I have 3 more questions left. I'd like to try to, this is the most unpleasant part of my job of working at the Einstein Forum, is having to deploy the police function at such events, but we're on a tight schedule, at least until lunch. So there was a question in the second to last row, and the man in the periwinkle blue shirt. Yeah, exactly.
I have 3 points. First, I'm glad that you solidified this pessimistic and defensive dark side of the Bandung spirit as a counter-containment that was seen as necessary against the US policy. That was kind of left out yesterday as an outcome of Bandung. 2 questions. One is about wasn't a big influence or big outcome of Bandung on the Indian side this the engagement in the United Nations, especially in the economic field of the neo-Fabianists, who played an important role to rebuild the international economic order. And the other one is, you didn't say much about the African relationships. We know that the Chinese minorities and the role and the situation of the Chinese minority in Southeast Asia played a role in the Bandung Conference. Was there also something that the situation and the tensions with the Indian minorities in Africa played a role in Nehru's considerations?
Thank you for your question. Starting quickly from the second one and coming back to the second. I've seen the papers that were just, for instance, produced by the Ministry of External Affairs official, the briefs and the policy papers ahead of the conference. And of course, they covered a number of issues, but this issue was not present in the documentation. From what I've seen, my answer would be no, but it's based on the evidence I've seen, so I can always stand to be corrected. With the second issue, of course, part of the Afro-Asian diplomacy also takes place within the United Nations itself. So it's interesting, though, that economic cooperation was also one of the issues discussed at Bandung. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs, actually, in an interministerial committee, different departments discussed and produced a paper on economic cooperation between Afro-Asian countries. And in 1956-57, there was an idea of actually organizing a Bandung Conference on economic cooperation between Afro-Asian countries. But their idea never quite fly. The Indian official mind was not particularly keen on pursuing it because they thought it would be actually very difficult to bring about. And so although was one of the issues discussed at Bandung, but never gained particular traction in the year after Bandung.
I have the last two questions, Professor Carlos Frankel and Philip Perrault. I'd actually like to combine them. If you could sort of each pose your question together, and then we'll allow Andrea to close it out then.
Yeah, thank you for, I think, 57 enlightening and also entertaining minutes, and for trying out all these metaphors. So I have an outsider question. I take it that Nehru was a prominent figure at Bandung, even though he was not really committed to it and originally not actually interested in it. And the main goal of your paper was to reconstruct the motives that led him to change his mind and embrace Bandung in a certain way. So you explained how he was not particularly keen on Afro-Asian solidarity, which I guess was the main purpose of the conference, but it wasn't particularly important to him. And he was mainly there to push this geopolitical agenda in the Cold War framework, insisting on peaceful coexistence, mainly interested in getting China to subscribe to it, so that India wouldn't have to put a lot of resources into the military and could redirect those resources towards prosperity, economy, and so on. And then you said, and this is what I want to ask about, you said that the archival evidence kind of pushed you to that conclusion, and that you expect some pushback from scholars of, in Afro-Asian studies. So what exactly is the sort of main controversial point that you worked out? I wonder if you could spell this out a little bit more for people like me who, come to this from the outside. Like, what exactly are you expecting to be criticized for, but through the reconstruction that you presented?
And then the question from Philip Perrault.
It's maybe less a question than a remark. The second Bandung almost happened. It was cancelled 3 days before it had to open because of the killing of Ben Bella. And I think that Nehru knew, on the one hand, the problem is Cold War tensions, but he was thinking about Armageddon. No, the Cold War tensions were, in fact, exercised in post-colonial, neo-colonial situations by killing more and more leftist leaders. Ben Berka, who was going to organize the Tricontinental in Havana, who was a Moroccan politician, Lumumba, etc. So Sukarno was probably right. He was also, in that year, suffering from a genocide against communists in his own country, and I vividly disagree with Bob Vitalis that it would be an ethnic cleansing. No, that was a genocide against communists. And the genocide against communists, as Vincent Bevins writes very succinctly, goes on and on and on. It's even called the Jakarta method. So the Cold War was a hot war in the global south, was a super hot war with so many deaths. And I think the only thing that Nehru misjudged is that it was going to be a nuclear Armageddon. The Armageddon was taking place, and that was the reason that Sukarno was pushing for the second Bandung in Algiers, and other leaders too. And I think that's something that is a bit evaporated out of our discussion here, that there was an enormous genocide against Marxists and communists in the global south.
Although, to be fair, Nehru, he was already dead in 1965 when
sure.
When the coup took place in Indonesia and Ben Bella.
But I mean, it's more like that his projection was right, that it was a Cold War problem, but that his projection that would be an Armageddon between the big nuclear forces was probably a misjudgment. And I think that the pressing for a second Bandung by Sukarno is also already from before '64. It starts in the late 50s. And I think there is indeed this necessity to, it's not anymore about peaceful coexistence. It's about defending yourself from the American containment. That's basically what was the more urgent thing to do at a certain point.
Thank you, Philip. No, I see what you say, and I mean, I was presenting in a sense the Indian position and the Indonesian position in a way. But yes, you raise a good point.
I don't say it as a critique.
No, and I didn't take it as such.
That part is really forgotten.
And I didn't.
It's kind of like dismissed by Mr. Vitalis as an ethnic war. I'm very sorry.
Nehru was probably feeling safe because he was the only left-winger in the right-wing cabinet, and the largest party in the opposition was also of the left, who were quite tame. So he was probably feeling safe, and that thing about the cleansing of the left was not happening around him, so it was not of immediate concern. But
Carlos, I'm realizing I'm feeling really guilty because I've spoken for 57 minutes after promise that I would be on time, and I was wondering if I could reply to your question over lunch, if you don't mind, because it might require just a little bit longer, and if you don't think it's a cop-out, but it's not cop-out, I will address the question. But I'm really.
I'm sorry, could you give a really short version for anybody who might be I'm also very curious to hear your answer.
Okay, no, provided that because I'm feeling really I'm aware that actually I've taken precious time off.
So don't take any more, just give us a summary, please.
I think the idea that actually for Nehru was a Cold War grand design, a Cold War strategy, that Nehru has been seen as one of the towering figure of Third Worldism, Afro-Asianism, in the mythology of Bandung, is seen up there. At the very least, by me presenting him as a sort of cold warrior with an olive branch is to some extent going against that mythology. I'm aware that perhaps I wouldn't be the one that would be on the firing line for saying those things, because at the end of the day, well, people might say he's a Cold War historian, his former mentor is Cold War history, and therefore I would say that I tried very carefully not to frame him in that particular way. But that's what I have in mind. Let's see in the next few months what turns out. I might get a sort of easy run or might eventually start getting a little bit of flogging, so academically speaking.
I'd like everyone to please join me in thanking Andrea Benvenuti. So thank you.